No one in the criminal underworld of Chicago dared to look Damien Voss directly in the eye. Men twice his size lowered their heads when he entered a room. Judges took his calls before their own wives did. He had built an empire on silence, precision, and fear, and he had never once needed to raise his voice to keep it standing. But at 2 in the morning, inside his own study, Damien Voss sat hunched over a laptop like a man watching something that frightened him more than any rival ever had. He had watched the same 11 minutes of footage 4 times. His security chief believed the cameras were for protecting a target. The staff believed they were for protecting an old woman who lived in a house full of strangers. Damien had told himself the same thing for weeks, the way a man tells himself a comfortable lie enough times that it starts to sound like the truth. Now he wasn't sure what they were protecting anymore. 2 years earlier, Rosalind Voss had been a woman who argued with priests about scripture, who could silence a table of grown men with one line delivered dry as gin, who gardened before sunrise because she liked being awake before the world had decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Then a stroke had taken the strength from the left side of her body. It had not taken her mind. It had not taken her wit, which could still cut clean when she wanted it to. What it had taken, slowly, in the quiet months afterward, was her belief that any of that still mattered. She could still speak sharply. She could still finish a crossword faster than the nurse the agency had first sent, and had fired within a week for talking to her like a child. But she moved through her own house now like a guest unsure of her welcome, waiting by the window in her chair for a son who came home later and less with every passing month. Damien told himself the cameras were about safety. His enemies were patient men, and a house full of unfamiliar staff was a house full of unknown risk. He had them installed in every hallway, every common room, every place his mother might be left alone. He did not install them to watch her. He installed them because he could not be there himself, and a camera was the closest thing to being there that his world would allow him. The agency sent over 3 candidates for the live and caregiving position. Damien barely glanced at the files. He had people for that. A woman named Emma Whitfield was hired on a Tuesday, mostly because she was the only one who could start that same week. She was quiet when she arrived. Heavy-set, plainly dressed, one worn suitcase, and a canvas bag of paperback novels. The head housekeeper walked her through the house in 20 minutes, showed her where the cleaning supplies were kept, and left her to it. Nobody thought to mention her to Damien at all. For the first few days, she was only another set of footsteps in the hallway. He noticed, without really noticing, that she was the first hire in months who hadn't asked Rosalind twice whether she needed the wheelchair pushed somewhere she hadn't asked to go. It was pure habit that finally brought him to the footage, the same late-night ritual he used to review security sweeps before sleep. He meant to glance through 10 minutes of the afternoon and go to bed. Instead, he found himself sitting very still. On the screen, his mother was in the sitting room in her usual chair by the window. But the new maid was not standing over her with a duster or a tray of pills. She was sitting on the floor, not kneeling, the way staff knelt to attend a patient. Sitting cross-legged, unhurried, like a woman with nowhere else she'd rather be. Rosalind was talking with her hands, the way she used to when a story was good enough to earn the effort. She reached the end of it, and Emma didn't rush in with a response the way the last 3 caregivers always had, filling silence, finishing sentences, treating every pause like something that needed fixing. She let the story land. She waited for it. And Rosalind laughed. Not the polite laugh she gave visitors out of manners. A real one, the kind that pulled her whole face into it. The kind Damien hadn't heard in the house since before the ambulance, before the silence. Before he'd started eating dinner alone at a table built for 12. He leaned toward the screen without deciding to. He did not know this woman. He did not know what she wanted, or why any of this was working, or whether it was working at all and not simply performance for whoever might be watching. In his world, nothing came free, and everyone who got close enough to matter eventually wanted something for it. He had learned that lesson at a cost he did not enjoy remembering. He told himself he would keep watching only because it was his job to know what happened inside his own house. He almost believed it. He rewound the clip, slower this time, studying it the way he studied a room before deciding it was safe to walk into. The set of Emma's shoulders. The way she reached for nothing, offered nothing, simply sat there like his mother's words were the only thing worth hearing in the building. Near the end of the clip, something raised the hair on the back of his neck. Emma glanced up, not at Rosalind. At the small black camera mounted where the wall met the crown molding, the one no ordinary maid would think to notice in her first week. She held the look for less than a second. Then, without any change in her face, without the flicker of guilt or nerves he would have expected from someone caught doing something they shouldn't, she turned back to Rosalind and kept listening, as if she hadn't looked at all. Damien sat back slowly, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. She had known the camera was there. Not just tonight. From the angle of her glance, she'd known for days, maybe from the first afternoon. And she had said nothing to anyone. She had simply gone on sitting on the floor beside a lonely old woman, handing over something warm and unhurried to a room she had every reason to believe no one important would ever see. Unless she'd known exactly who might be watching all along. He thought of every doctor he'd flown in from 3 states, every specialist, every security upgrade that had cost more than most men made in a year. None of it had done what he just watched a woman in a thrift store cardigan do in 11 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. For a salary that wouldn't cover his tailor's bill. Damien did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark long after the footage ended, turning over the one question he could not silence. What is this woman really doing in my house? By the 4th night, Damien noticed something about himself that he didn't like. He was checking the footage before he checked his messages. Men were waiting on his word about a shipment coming through the port. A judge he'd spent 2 years cultivating wanted a call returned. None of it moved him out of the chair the way 11 seconds of grainy video did. His mother's hand, steady for once, reaching for the teapot on her own. He watched it 3 times before he let himself go to bed. The clips came in fragments now, stitched together from different hours, different rooms, because Emma didn't confine herself to one corner of the house the way the last caregivers had. She was in the kitchen at breakfast, buttering nothing, just watching while Rosalind's spoon wobbled its way from the bowl to her mouth and back, unassisted, slower than it should take a grown woman to eat cereal, and Emma didn't move to help once. Damien felt his jaw tighten watching it. He almost called the housekeeper right then to ask why the new girl was letting his mother struggle through breakfast like there was no one in the room. Then he watched the next clip, filmed 20 minutes later, and understood something he hadn't wanted to. Rosalind, alone at the table, was smiling at her own empty bowl like she'd won something. He sat with that for a long moment before he closed the laptop. The gossip reached him the way gossip always did in his house, sideways, through someone who thought they were simply making conversation. The head housekeeper mentioned, almost as an aside while reviewing the week's staffing, that the new girl talked back to Mrs. Voss. Didn't jump every time she was asked to jump. Made her wait sometimes for things she could clearly get herself. Damien said nothing. He went upstairs that night and pulled the footage instead of asking questions out loud. Because questions out loud had a way of turning into decisions he wasn't ready to make. What he found wasn't neglect. It was a pattern. Rosalind's cane slipped off the arm of her chair one afternoon and clattered to the floor. On camera, Emma was 3 feet away, folding laundry, and she didn't so much as glance over for a full 4 seconds. Long enough that Damien's stomach dropped. Long enough that his hand actually moved toward the phone to call someone in that room immediately. Then Rosalind, muttering something under her breath that made Emma's mouth twitch, leaned forward in her chair, gripped the armrest, and bent to retrieve the cane herself. It took her nearly a minute. Her hand shook the entire way down. She got it. Emma didn't clap, didn't make a fuss. She just said something short. Damien couldn't make out the words, and went back to the laundry like nothing had happened at all. Rosalind, for her part, sat up a little straighter for the rest of the afternoon. Damien rewound it twice, then a 3rd time, watching his mother's face in the seconds after she'd picked the cane up herself. He knew that expression. He'd seen it on men who'd just closed a deal they'd been sweating over for months. Pride. Actual pride, over a cane. He thought about the specialist from Northwestern who charged $11,000 to tell him his mother needed to stay engaged with small physical tasks to preserve mobility and self-efficacy, and had then spent 40 minutes doing everything for her during the consultation because it was faster. Nobody had told Emma anything. Or if they had, she hadn't been in the room to hear it. Over the following days, small things kept surfacing. Rosalind asking for Emma by name for tasks that had nothing to do with caregiving, help picking out a scarf, someone to sit with while she finished a book she'd apparently started 3 times and never finished. Rosalind talking more at dinner, according to the kitchen staff, than she had in a year. A word Damien heard twice from 2 different people without asking either of them for it. Lighter. She seemed lighter. He found himself watching a clip from the garden late one evening, Rosalind pointing out something in the flower beds. Some plant she used to grow before the stroke. before the wheelchair made the garden feel like a place that belonged to someone else. Emma crouched down next to the bed, not doing the digging, just handing Rosalind the small trowel and waiting while she worked the soil with a hand that trembled and did not stop. It took Rosalind almost 10 minutes to plant one bulb. Emma sat in the dirt beside her the entire time and didn't touch it once. Damien closed the laptop at night with a strange, unfamiliar tightness behind his ribs. He had spent his whole adult life believing that competence meant doing things for people, moving faster, solving harder, fixing more completely than anyone else could. It was how he built everything he owned. It had never once occurred to him that sometimes the most competent thing a person could do was nothing at all, and mean it. He wanted to understand her. Not because he trusted her. He didn't. Not yet. Not with the kind of instinct that had kept him alive this long. But because something about the way she moved through his house didn't fit any shape he recognized. She wanted nothing from Rosalind. She asked for nothing from the estate beyond what her contract already gave her. She did her actual duties without complaint, the mopping and the laundry and the grocery lists. And then she spent whatever was left of her day sitting on floors and garden dirt for a woman who wasn't paying her to be kind. Late that night, restless, he found the head housekeeper's staffing file and pulled Emma's employment record. Nothing but the basics the agency had sent over. References. A start date. No red flags. No history worth mentioning, according to whoever had filed it. He asked, almost offhand, whether the housekeeper knew anything more about her. The woman thought about it for a second too long before she answered. She mentioned once she used to do this kind of work somewhere else. Family thing, I think. She doesn't talk about it much. A pause. Actually, now that you ask, she doesn't talk about herself at all. Damien sat with that sentence longer than he meant to. In a house full of people who wanted things from him, favors, protection, proximity to his money and his name, he had just found the one person who seemed to want nothing, and had a past she kept locked tighter than his own front gates. He didn't know why that unsettled him more than anything he'd seen on the footage all week. But it did. Damien didn't often speak to staff directly. He gave instructions through the housekeeper, through Bruno's counterpart on the domestic side, through anyone who could carry a sentence from his mouth to the right pair of hands without requiring him to stand in a room and make conversation. It was efficient. It was also, he was beginning to realize, a habit that had let an entire year pass without him learning a single thing about the woman who had done more for his mother than anyone on his payroll. He found Emma in the small pantry off the kitchen, restocking tea, and he did something he hadn't planned to do. He asked her a question that wasn't in order. How long have you done this kind of work? She looked up, mildly startled, not nervous, just surprised that he'd spoken to her at all. Caregiving? On and off, since I was 19. She set down a tin of Earl Grey, precise, unhurried. Started with my grandmother. What happened to her? Something in Emma's face closed, gently, the way a door closes when someone doesn't want it to slam. She had Parkinson's. I looked after her for 6 years, until she passed. She said it flatly, without inviting follow-up, and went back to the shelf. Damien let it go. He had built a career out of knowing when a locked door wasn't worth forcing. But the footage told him more than she ever would out loud. He caught it 2 nights later, Rosalind, deep in one of her stories, mentioning almost in passing that she'd once trained as a nurse's aide before she married Damien's father. Before the war of raising a family and running a household had swallowed the plan whole. Emma went still in a way the camera barely caught, her hands pausing over the folding she was doing, and asked, quietly, whether Rosalind had ever regretted not finishing it. Every year of my life, Rosalind said, and laughed like it was a joke, and it clearly wasn't. I almost finished mine too, Emma said. Certification. Got about 4 months from done. She didn't explain further. Rosalind, sharper than most people gave a stroke survivor credit for, didn't push. She just reached over, slow, deliberate, her weaker hand doing the work, and patted Emma's arm once. And the two of them sat there in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it at all. Damien watched that clip more times than he wanted to admit to himself. A week later, Bruno, the only man in the organization Damien trusted with things that had nothing to do with the organization, mentioned, almost as a courtesy, that one of the newer housekeeping staff had raised a concern. That the new maid was getting close to Mrs. Voss in a way that didn't sit right. That she seemed to be angling for something, a permanent position, a bigger role, access she hadn't earned. Damien didn't dismiss it outright. He'd built his life on the assumption that everyone wanted something, and the ones who looked like they wanted nothing were usually the ones who wanted the most. He pulled 2 weeks of footage that night and watched almost all of it, hunting specifically for an angle, a tell, a moment where Emma's kindness bent toward advantage. He found a woman who turned down an offered bonus for extra hours because she said she'd rather have the afternoon free to sit with Rosalind in the garden, hours she wasn't being paid for at all. He found a woman who never once mentioned Damien's name, his money, his position, even when Rosalind brought him up, which she did often and fondly. He found no tell. Only consistency, which in Damien's experience was rarer and more suspicious than almost anything else. Until it wasn't suspicious at all. Until it was just what it looked like. Rosalind, when the same rumor reached her secondhand through the grapevine of a house that could never keep a secret for long, did something Damien hadn't seen her do since before the stroke. She got angry. She is the first person in 2 years who has spoken to me like I still have a mind, Rosalind told him, sitting straighter in her chair than her physical therapist had managed to get her in months. Everyone else in this house tiptoes around me like I might break, or worse, like I already have. She doesn't. And if someone is trying to push her out because of that, you tell them they'll have to push me out first. Damien had not seen his mother fight for anything in a long time. He found he didn't hate seeing it now. Late that night, reviewing an older, unindexed clip that had never been flagged for anything, he found something he wasn't looking for. The room was empty except for Rosalind, asleep in her chair by the fire, and Emma, alone at the far side of it, holding a small framed photograph she'd taken down from the mantel. A young man in an army uniform and smiling. The kind of photograph every old house had somewhere and nobody looked at anymore. Emma held it for a long time. Her shoulders moved once, twice, in the unmistakable rhythm of someone crying without wanting to be heard doing it. She wiped her face quickly with the back of her wrist, set the photograph back exactly where it had been, squared it so it sat at the same angle, and sat back down beside Rosalind as though nothing had happened at all. Damien sat very still in his study, watching a woman grieve something he knew nothing about, in a room she believed was empty for the second time. He thought of his own guilt, quiet, expensive, easily written off as a busy schedule, and felt, for the first time, a flicker of shame at how easily he let a rumor make him doubt her. His phone buzzed on the desk before he could finish the thought. It was Bruno. Not about the shipment, not about the judge. Heard something else about the maid. Might not be nothing this time. She was let go from her last placement, not by choice. Word is it wasn't clean. You'll want to hear it before you decide anything else. Damien looked at the paused frame still open on his screen, Emma's hand smoothing the photograph back into place, gentle as a held breath, and then at the message glowing on his phone. He had 2 versions of this woman in front of him now, and he no longer knew which one was true. The sound reached Damien before the words did, a crash, then a scream that didn't belong in a house this quiet, and he was out of his study and down 2 flights of stairs before he'd fully registered moving. He found the sitting room in chaos. Rosalind was on the floor near the bookshelf, her chair overturned 3 feet away, her face white with a pain she was trying badly to hide. Emma was on her knees beside her, hands hovering, not touching, asking questions too fast for anyone to answer. Where does it hurt? Can you feel your legs? Don't move yet. Don't move. While the head housekeeper stood frozen in the doorway with her hands pressed to her mouth. The ambulance took 11 minutes. It felt like 11 years. At the hospital, in a hallway that smelled like every hospital hallway Damien had ever stood in, waiting for news about someone he couldn't protect no matter how much money he threw at the problem. Something in him snapped shut the way it used to before Emma Whitfield had ever walked through his front door. He turned on her before the doctor had even come out. She was trying to reach a book, he said, voice low and cold in the way that made grown men in his other life go pale. On the top shelf. Alone. Why was she alone? Why was she standing at all? Emma didn't flinch, but something in her face went very still. I was in the hallway. I heard her fall. You let her get up there. I didn't let her do anything, Mr. Voss. She's a grown woman. She fell. His voice cracked on the second word, and he hated that it did. She could have broken her hip. She could have died on that floor because you thought giving her space was more important than watching her. Emma opened her mouth, then closed it. He watched her decide, visibly, not to defend herself, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had judged, correctly, that nothing she said in that hallway was going to reach him. I'll wait for word on her condition, she said quietly, and stepped back, and didn't argue again. "You're finished here," Damien said. "Effective tonight." She nodded once, eyes wet but her voice steady, and walked to the far end of the hallway to sit alone, and did not leave the hospital. Rosalind was in surgery for a fractured wrist and a sprained hip. Bad, painful. But not the catastrophe Damien's imagination had already built and rebuilt 6 different ways in the ambulance. When she was finally stable and lucid enough to have visitors, Damien went first, ready to apologize to her for failing to protect her, ready to tell her Emma was gone. Rosalind spoke before he could get a word out. "Where is she?"
Mom, where?
"Is Emma?" "She's outside." "Mom, I let her go." "I should have." "You did what?" Rosalind's voice, thin from the anesthesia, but sharp as it had ever been in her life, cut clean through the room. "Damien Anthony Voss. That girl did not push me up on that shelf. I did that. Me. On my own 2 feet, which I have been working for months to be able to stand on again, and which, may I remind you, no doctor and no amount of your money managed to get me back. She did. And you are going to fire her because I finally did something you didn't ask permission for first." Damien stood there, silenced by his own mother in a way 3 assassination attempts had never managed. "I wanted to surprise her," Rosalind said, quieter now, some of the fire going out of her, replaced by something closer to grief. "I've been practicing standing at the shelf every morning for 2 weeks so I could reach that book myself and show her I could. I didn't tell her because I wanted it to be mine. Just once, something that was entirely mine." Her eyes filled. "I would rather fall trying to live in my own house than sit safe in a chair for the rest of my life being watched. Do you understand that? Do you understand what it has cost me to sit in that chair for 2 years while people who love me decide what I'm still capable of?" Damien said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. That night, unable to sleep in the hospital's family room, he pulled up the footage on his phone out of habit he could no longer break, and found the clip from earlier that afternoon, the minutes before the fall, which no one had thought to check yet, because everyone had assumed they already knew what happened. Emma was not near the shelf. She was down the hall, visible at the very edge of the frame, folding linens, exactly where she'd said she was. The moment the crash sounded, she was moving before the second frame even changed. Faster than anyone Damien had ever watched cross a room, faster than his own security team moved on a bad night. And she reached Rosalind within 4 seconds of the fall, already assessing, already calm, already doing everything right. She had not encouraged this. She had not even known about it. She had simply, for weeks, given his mother enough room to try, and his mother, fiercely, stubbornly, wonderfully herself again, had tried. Damien sat in the dim family room with his head in his hands, the phone still glowing in his palm, and understood with a sinking clarity that he had just fired the one person who had done more for his mother in 2 months than he had managed in 2 years. And he'd done it in a hospital hallway, in front of her, without checking a single fact first. He was already composing the apology in his head when his phone buzzed with a message from Bruno that had nothing to do with Emma at all. "Need you back at the estate tonight. Not about the maid. We've got a problem with the Castellano crew. Someone's been feeding them information on the house schedule. Security's been compromised for weeks. Whoever it is knows the mansion layout, staff rotations, even Mrs. Voss's routine. Could be anyone on the household staff. We need to lock the place down and go through every name on payroll, starting with anyone who joined in the last 6 months." Damien read it twice and felt the floor of the night shift again beneath him. Emma had started 8 weeks ago. Damien did not sleep. He drove back to the estate at 4 in the morning with Bruno's message still open on his phone and a second, colder thought sitting underneath it. One he didn't like admitting even to himself, that some small, tired part of him had almost wanted it to be Emma. Wanted a clean reason. Wanted the fear from the hospital hallway to have been right after all, because that would be easier than sitting with what he actually owed her. It took Bruno's team 6 hours to find the leak, and it wasn't Emma. It was a groundskeeper hired 4 months earlier, quietly in debt to men who did business with the Castellanos, who had been selling scraps of the household schedule for cash he needed faster than his wages could provide it. He was handled quietly, the way these things were always handled, and by mid-morning the threat that had kept Damien's chest tight all night had been closed like a door, which left him with no excuse left to avoid the other conversation. He pulled Emma's personnel file properly this time, not the agency summary, but the real one. The one his people built on anyone who spent more than a season near his mother. It took an hour to assemble. He read it standing up in his study, The same room where he'd first watched her sit down on the floor beside his mother and stay there. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had raised her after Emma's parents split when she was 12, and had done it on almost nothing. Parkinson's had come for Eleanor when Emma was 19, 3 months into a nursing assistant certification program she'd been paying for herself, one exam at a time. Emma had quit the program with 4 months left to finish it, because Eleanor couldn't be left alone anymore and there was no one else. 6 years of it, feeding, bathing, lifting a woman who got harder to lift every year, watching her grandmother lose, piece by piece. The same thing Rosalind was fighting to hold on to. Eleanor died the year Emma turned 25. The relationship Emma had been in at the time didn't survive the 6 years either. The file noted, in the flat language of a background check, that the fiancé had left during year 4. There was no line in the report about what that had cost her. There didn't need to be. Afterward, with no certification, no savings, and a decade of experience nobody would pay for on paper, Emma had taken domestic work because it let her be near people who needed exactly the kind of care she knew how to give, even if the title on her paycheck said something smaller than the truth. Damien found one more thing in the file that made him sit down. 3 weeks earlier, before the fall, before any of it, an agency in Winnetka had offered Emma a position paying nearly double her current wage. She had turned it down within 2 days, no negotiation, no counteroffer requested. She had never mentioned it to anyone in the house. He found her in the small staff sitting room off the kitchen, still there, still packed. A single worn suitcase by the door like she'd been ready to leave the moment he told her to, and hadn't quite managed it yet. "I read your file," he said, because he didn't know a better way to start. Emma looked up, guarded. "Then you know I didn't lie about anything. I know you turned down a job that would have paid you almost double 3 weeks ago, and never told a single person in this house." He sat down across from her, which he almost never did with staff, which he realized, watching her face, she noticed immediately. "Why?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because your mother was 3 days into finally believing she could stand at that shelf on her own. I wasn't going to leave in the middle of that for a better paycheck." She looked down at her hands. "I know how it looks. Like I'm telling you this now so you'll feel bad and give me my job back. I don't want that. I just didn't want you thinking I did any of this for the money, because I didn't. I never had money in mind once." "I know," Damien said. "I already know that. I've known it for weeks and I fired you anyway, in a hallway, because I was frightened and it was easier to be angry at you than to be angry at how little control I actually have over what happens to her." He made himself say the next part plainly, because he'd built his whole life on precision, and this deserved nothing less. "I was wrong. I'm asking you to come back. Not because I need someone to watch my mother. Because she needs you specifically, and so apparently do I." Emma's composure, the same composure that had held through 6 years of her grandmother's decline, through a fiancé who left, through a wrongful firing in a hospital hallway, finally cracked, just slightly, at the corner of her eyes. "I didn't tell anyone about my grandmother because I didn't want it to be why you kept me," she said. "I didn't want pity to be the reason I still had a job." "It isn't," Damien said. "It's the reason I finally understand what you've actually done in this house. There's a difference." Later that evening, sitting with Rosalind, who had come home from the hospital that afternoon with her wrist in a cast and her chin set at the stubborn angle Damien remembered from childhood, his mother said something that stayed with him longer than anything in the personnel file had. "She didn't teach me to pour tea, or plant a bulb, or reach a shelf, Damien. Those were never the point. Rosalind's good hand found his. She taught me I was still someone worth sitting on the floor for. You can't buy that. God knows you've tried in your way, sending doctors and cameras and locks on every door. But that's not the same thing as someone choosing to stay." Damien sat with that until the room had gone dark around them. He found Emma again near the end of the night, standing by the front window, still holding her coat like she hadn't fully believed she was staying. "I want to do something for you," he said. "Properly. Not severance. Not an apology check." Emma's shoulders straightened, already forming the refusal he'd watched her give 3 times that week to lesser offers. "Mr. Voss, I don't need." "This isn't charity," Damien said before she could finish. "I want to ask you something first." He watched her go still, waiting, the question hanging unanswered in the space between them as the hallway clock ticked toward midnight. 6 weeks later, the house sounded different before anyone said a word. You could hear it from the front gate. A window opened somewhere on the second floor. Music drifting down from the kitchen radio Rosalind had insisted be turned back on after 2 years of silence. The particular rhythm of two women laughing at something in the garden that had nothing to do with medicine or recovery or any of the words that used to fill this house instead. The question Damien had asked Emma that night by the window had not been complicated, in the end, though it had taken him 3 attempts to say it plainly. What did you want to be before your grandmother got sick? Emma had answered slowly, like the question hadn't been asked of her in over a decade, and the muscles for answering it had gone stiff with disuse.
A nurse.
Geriatric care, specifically the kind of medicine that didn't get talked about at dinner parties. The unglamorous work of helping people hold on to themselves at the end of their lives. She'd been 4 months from her certification when Eleanor's diagnosis had ended the conversation for her. Damien didn't offer her money that night. He offered to finish what she'd started. Full tuition, the certification program in Winnetka she'd once turned down a job to stay near his mother instead of pursuing. Restructured now so she could complete it while still working at the estate, if that was what she wanted. Or take it somewhere else entirely if it wasn't. No contract requiring her to stay. No condition attached to Rosalind's care. Just the 4 months she'd given up, handed back to her, with no strings sewn into it. It had taken Emma 3 days to say yes. Damien understood, by then, exactly why she needed the 3 days. She had spent a decade making sure nothing she did could be mistaken for wanting something in return. And accepting this meant letting that guard down in a way that clearly cost her something to allow. The change in Rosalind, by the time autumn turned toward its 2nd month, was the kind of thing that didn't need footage to prove it. She walked the length of the garden path most mornings now, cane in hand instead of wheels beneath her. Slower than she used to move, but entirely on her own 2 feet. The easel Emma had quietly dragged out of storage in week 3, Rosalind had painted once. Before marriage and motherhood had folded the habit away somewhere she'd stopped looking for it. Stood permanently now near the sitting room window, half-finished canvases stacked against the wall like evidence of a woman who had somewhere to put her hands again. One evening, Damien came home earlier than he had and longer than he could remember and found the sitting room empty except for his mother. Dozing lightly in her chair by the fire, a paperback open face down on her lap. He didn't call for anyone. He didn't check his phone. He crossed the room and lowered himself onto the floor beside her chair, cross-legged, unhurried. The exact position he had watched, months earlier, from the wrong side of a camera screen and mistaken for something he needed to investigate rather than something he needed to learn. Rosalind woke a few minutes later, looked down at her son sitting on the floor like a boy waiting to be told a story, and didn't say anything about it at all. She just reached down, rested her hand on his shoulder, and left it there. That was the whole scene. It was enough. Dinner, the following week, was the first meal in over 2 years that the long table in the dining room actually earned its size. Damien at one end, Rosalind at the other, and Emma, invited without ceremony and accepted without argument, seated between them like she had always belonged there and simply hadn't been asked yet. Nobody called it a celebration. It didn't need to be one to feel like something worth remembering. Late that night, after his mother had gone up to bed and the house had settled into the particular quiet it kept now, not the old, hollow quiet of an empty house, but the ordinary quiet of a full one at rest, Damien found Emma in the kitchen and pulled up an old file on his laptop, one he hadn't opened again since the very first night. "This is the clip that started it," he said, turning the screen toward her. 11 minutes of an autumn afternoon, Rosalind laughing on a couch, hands moving through a story, and Emma on the floor beside her, listening like it was the only thing worth doing in the world. "I've watched it more times than I'd ever admit to anyone but you. It's the reason I started paying attention to what I'd actually been missing in this house." Emma looked at the frozen frame for a long moment, then at him. "I always wondered if you knew the camera was there when I looked at it," she said quietly. "I never planned on anyone watching. I just wasn't going to stop what I was doing because someone might." "I know," Damien said. That's why it mattered. The cameras were still running throughout the house, still doing the job he'd installed them for in the first place. But somewhere in the last 2 months, without him quite deciding it on purpose, they had stopped feeling like surveillance and started feeling like something closer to a record, proof, saved and archived, of the exact hour a house that had forgotten how to be lived in had started breathing again. Damien Voss had spent his entire life believing that anything worth having could be bought, secured, or controlled if a man was willing to pay enough for it. He still believed, in the world outside these walls, that this was mostly true. But inside them, he had finally learned the one thing is money, his cameras, and his fear had never been able to purchase on their own. That sometimes the person who changes everything in a powerful man's world is the one nobody thought to notice at all. Sitting quietly on the floor, giving away something that was never for sale in the first place. If this story touched something in you tonight, we'd love to hear from you. Do you think Damien was right to trust Emma, even when everyone around him underestimated her? Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and which part of Emma and Rosalind's story moved you the most. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this one. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people beside you.